Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl says he was tortured by the Taliban. Bergdahl says the terrorists made him stay inside a metal cage for long periods of time without daylight or anything. That after he tried unsuccessfully to escape twice. Now, doctors say he will not suffer from any long-term physical problems from what they can see. However, they do say his psychological state is more than fragile here, and he's not in any condition to even be reunited with his family. Now, military officials say, unaware of the firestorm that his release has caused, fellow troops, some of which at least say he deserted them and was captured due to his own actions. Some lawmakers say the president shouldn't have even negotiated with terrorists, and Bergdahl's parents, they are even receiving death threats. Now, a far different scene in Qatar, where the 5 Taliban leaders who were released from Gitmo now being forced to live their celebrated lives here with other Taliban members, and this scene has got many people upset. But there are many outstanding questions attached to this, and they go beyond the media handling of it and everything else. But the basic question when this all comes down to is, can and should the United States ever negotiate with terrorists, even for the release of one of their own? Well, I spoke with Mitchell Reese, former director of the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department, about his take on the Bergdahl prisoner swap, as well as his book on the very subject, Negotiating with Evil, When to Talk to Terrorists. Well, the controversy surrounding the release of Army Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl has gained international attention, raising a whole host of issues. And tonight, Mitchell Reese, president of Washington College, as well as a national security expert and author of, among other books, Negotiating with Evil, When to Talk to Terrorists. He's kind enough to join us with more on this. Mitchell, thank you very much for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I mean, we talk about from last century when LBJ, Richard Nixon, obviously Ronald Reagan, and others. As you said, this crosses party lines. But the question about when it is advisable and when it isn't, and if you can draw upon your own experiences in Northern Ireland in trying to get the Good Friday Accord, and we've spoken to Senator Mitchell many times about this question. Talk about, this is a known terrorist organization, the IRA, obviously. The decision from a practical and then also from an I guess a moral level, talking to people you know that are doing bad things, but you know in the end result here, if you don't have two parties that are basically signing up, I guess, for the same common goal, it's not going to work.
Well, that's exactly right. And typically this starts out not at a very high level, but rather with low-level intelligence officers testing to see if members of a terrorist group have an interest in engaging, to see if there's a way to end the violence. And at a certain point, a judgment is made that you need to take these talks out of the darkness, bring them into the light, and create a formal diplomatic process. And this is a very perilous time for any government, but especially a democratically elected government, who quite rightly has been demonizing the terrorist group, but now has to explain to its constituents why it decides that it's in the best interest to actually sit down and engage with them. And this is fraught with moral peril, national security interests, of course, and you make a judgment that there's a greater good that is possible to be reached. But again, you have to make that initial step without having any certainty that you'll have the type of outcome that we were able to reach in Northern Ireland.
How do the metrics work of this? I was always fascinated when an Israeli soldier was captured and literally there'd be 1,000 to 1 swap here. When trying to figure out what the balance is, in this case, 5 members that were sitting in Gitmo that were swapped here, in fact, for Mr. Bergdahl, how do they work out the math, and are they concerned about precedent every time they do it?
Well, I think that it really highlights an asymmetry, especially for democratically elected governments. You refer to the Gilad Shalit transfer in Israel, where the Israelis gave up over 900 Palestinian prisoners, including some really despicable human beings, in order to free Shalit after 4+ years. Here the math was 5 to 1, and the question for me is not so much the math, but rather what happens to these 5 individuals after their year of probation is up in gutter. Will they return to the battlefield? We know that almost 30% of people who have been freed from Guantanamo have returned to the fight. These are 5 very serious, very experienced, very senior operatives. They're very dangerous. What safeguards are there to make sure that they will not return to the battlefield and harm Americans or harm our allies in the region.
Well, you've obviously counseled leaders across the globe on some of these tricky situations. If this president went for you for counsel and said this is a no-win situation, we're giving up 5 potentially bad guys that could end up back on the battlefield. We are in some ways legitimizing the Taliban, but at the same end, we have that mantra of leave no man behind. I'm sure there's more information we're still not privy to, his health, etc. That all said, do you think the president made the right decision?
Well, again, I think we need some more information. In terms of the rollout, I think it's quite clear it could have been done better. I would not want to expose my president to have the responsibility of owning this decision, at least not in a public way on day one. I would have outsourced it to the Secretary of Defense. Even better, I would have asked the Secretary of Defense to stand with some Republican Party leaders in Congress, like Senator McCain, to make it a bipartisan effort. I also would not have characterized it on the one hand as a national security decision and on the other as a humanitarian gesture. So there's been a garble from the White House. I think the president has been exposed in ways that I think the White House is now finding difficult to walk back.
In terms of the advise and consent or lack thereof that Congress got before this swap was made, can you have it both ways? Can the president, in effect, go to the Intelligence Committee chairs in the House and Senate, let's say, or Republican leadership? Or do you risk that if you do this in a highly politicized and partisan climate, that it's going to get out ahead of you and you only have one real shot here, and this really should be the purview of the commander-in-chief? This doesn't have to be a congressional, joint decision.
Well, I think you've put your finger on it. It's a risk if you do it. It's a risk if you don't do it. And clearly there's been bipartisan outrage led by Senator Feinstein about the lack of consultation.
Is it also that part of this is what happens next in the story? I'm not even talking domestically in, who has what role and who should or shouldn't have been spoken to, but has a door been opened to the Taliban in terms of potential negotiation? We all know our timeline and our drawdown there. Is this about more than just Bergdahl, that now we may be trying to co-opt some of the senior level folks there about what happens next in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that was the hope of this administration for some time. And it was the hope that this transfer would actually open the door to broader negotiations that would talk about the Taliban's role in a post-America Afghanistan. From everything I've read and heard from my colleagues in Washington, the Taliban has rejected that type of engagement, at least for the time being. But there's also something that's taking place here, and that is every time we engage with the Taliban leader, we learn a little bit more about the organization. We learn a little bit more about the people who are sitting opposite us. That's very helpful for our intelligence community.
Well, it came out a few years ago, but if you want to talk about a timely book in terms of this conversation, Negotiating with Evil, is that. Mitchell Reese, I really appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We'll continue to follow the story. But when we come back, I want to bring the table in on this. You probably remember where you were. It's one of those moments that you say, what's going on? Turn up the audio. The Bronco chase. That's right. The O.J. Simpson, what would lead to the trial, and that's 20 years ago, believe it or not, to the day. We're going to talk about what we learned not through that trial and what, if anything, has changed from, believe it or not, this scene here, and it led to, well, we know what. Stay with us. We'll be right back.